Hi, I'm Maria Moats, and I lead PwC's Governance Insight Center. I'm here with Mitra, PwC's first technology impact leader. And with over 20 years of experience as a technologist and innovator, Mitra is now applying technology to address the most important and pressing societal and environmental issues. So today's conversation will focus on technology and the impact on ESG. So Mitra, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Maria, for having me.
Of course. Now, let's go to the first question, and it's around ESG. ESG is a big umbrella. It incorporates a lot of topics, and our boards are actively engaged in all of these topics. Now, in this past year, we saw a real shift in our boards leaning in, and we saw it in our corporate directors survey. We saw that 64% of the directors told us that ESG is now linked to company strategy, a 15-point increase from last year. So ESG is at the top of the game. So Mitra, tell us what are you seeing in the ESG area?
Well, ESG is rightfully on top of mind for board members, primarily because regulations and policies are shifting and evolving both locally and globally. And I think beyond compliance, ESG has become a much bigger issue in the public consciousness, mainly manifesting from three distinct pressure points. One, the increase in ethical consumerism, where we see consumers paying more for products whose brands they believe in and boycotting or even, canceling the brands that don't align with their ethos. The second one is pressures from the workforce. The workforce is now making employment decisions based on the ethos of the employer. For example, people are taking lesser paying jobs with companies they believe in, and they're resigning from companies they don't trust. And lastly, the increase in shareholder activism and the investment community in general, with the focus on ESG, forcing the heightened awareness around it. For example, we see asset owners freezing out companies who don't report on their ESG data.
Absolutely. So shareholders are increasingly, to your point, really wanting to discuss ESG issues with directors. And they really want to make sure that the data that they're getting, the disclosures, are investor grade. Now, technology can really help here, but they're also concerned that technology, as you know, goes at a fast pace. In our last survey, 91% of the directors said, we get technology and how it could help, but we're really worried that it's really disruptive. So Can you help us understand specifically how technology can really help with these ESG efforts?
Sure. Technology is basically underpins every strategic decision that's made at the executive level. It's not just ESG. However, we can't expect board members to become technologists, but they need to be aware of technologies, both incumbent and emerging, that have the potential to solve some of the ESG goals, and to truly understand the use case and why are these technologies relevant, and be able to ask the appropriate questions of their management teams so that they can, pressure test those proposals. In terms of prioritization across all industries, most boards need to be cognizant about a few emerging areas where technology plays a significant role in achieving those ESG goals. One is managing your carbon footprint and waste. Secondly, managing the workforce complexities. And finally, data security and privacy.
Right, no question. Those are all good ones. So let's think about carbon footprint first. In our latest director survey as well, 73% of the respondents really expressed concern around climate, the crisis, and as you know, for years, institutional investors have been asking for greater disclosure in this area. So when you think about the opportunity here to use technology in the area of reducing carbon footprint, give us some examples of what that means to you.
Well, I'm actually not surprised that there's heightened concern around climate action. The lines are blurring between climate action and high performance and risk management. Supply chain is an area where organizations should place more focus to reduce their carbon footprint and at the same time maximize their growth and minimize their risks. And when I say supply chain, I mean the entire value chain that enables a business, regardless of what industry you're in. And there are a couple areas in particular where technology plays a significant role. One is creating trust and transparency in the supply chain so that you can actually set goals, measure your footprint, and then report on it. That's very important and truly only enabled through technology. Secondly, creating new structures that are efficient and sustainable to reduce your carbon emissions.
Right. So let's get into the concept that you discussed. You brought it up around building trust with your stakeholders, really managing your supply chain carbon emissions. These are all important to companies and to directors as well. If we think about scope 3 emissions, emissions that really you can't control, they're not your own, right? And the footprint there, these emissions can be the most challenging for companies to address. So, can you give us some examples of emerging technologies that address these types of emissions?
Blockchain technology is an emerging area where we are seeing major enablement around trust and transparency. Giving you real-time access to where and when materials were sourced, manufactured, transported, stored, sold. And this is, unprecedented information that we have. Today, we have blockchain applications that are tracking carbon emissions in real time. And when you have two of the world's major retailers using blockchain to track their supply chain, you know that this technology is not experimental anymore. We're in the real thick of it. Beyond trust and transparency and actually trying to reduce the carbon footprint, companies are using AI and analytics in certain areas to create new structures and new updates to their supply chain. For example, in forecasting demand or strategically prioritizing sourcing and optimizing their transportation routes.
Perfect. So now let's go to another focus area, and that's the workforce and the complexities. Directors are now very focused on talent management, as you know, whereas in the past they were really focused on kind of the CEO, C-suite level. Now, because of the talent shortages, everything that we're reading about, the significant change around how our talent works at all levels of the organization, directors care. So what technology do you see that management is using that is helpful and that boards should be aware of?
Well, what's interesting is talent management is now a whole new beast because talent management is trying to solve the workforce paradox. This is a completely new phenomenon that we have never had in the history of employment, which by that term, workforce paradox, I'm referring to the simultaneous state of millions of people being unemployed and millions of job openings without viable candidates. And there are three primary factors fueling this paradox. One is the widening skill gap. Secondly is lack of diversity in the workforce. And third, mental well-being and the great resignation that we're all hearing about. There are technologies that can address each of these. Companies are using AI in different ways to accelerate closing the skill gap. For example, using AI to enable individualized learning journeys, learning pathways, where employees are given a new learning path based on their current skills and the skills that the organization needs. So a path to bridge that gap. Others are using AI to identify qualified talent in their organization and matching them with open projects, not roles, but projects, and in effect becoming their own staffing agency using these internal talent marketplaces. To increase diversity, companies are looking to automating their application review process to reduce sort of human bias in the hiring process, and using online collaboration platforms that incentivize inclusivity and ideas from all over the workforce to retain their diverse talent. VR or virtual reality learning training programs are being used to teach in an experiential way how employees can develop their empathy and work effectively across cultures. And lastly, there are AI-enabled analytical tools that are helping companies monitor and track, analyze their equity in workforce composition and in their promotions and advancements, and enable them to report on that data. So these are, examples of what companies are doing in to increase diversity through technology. And around mental well-being and the Great Resignation, we all know that that is impacting business continuity. So companies are turning to consumer digital health apps and using them at the enterprise level to help manage the well-being of their employee and their workforce. For example, they're using wearables to track biometrics in the employees on an individual level to create customized health strategies for them. Or using, again, VR, virtual reality, to create these private experiences, private and individualized experiences for their employees to treat their anxiety or burnout. Very forward-looking companies are actually using proactive technology, so voice and facial recognition plus natural language processing to detect burnout before it actually happens. So there are technologies being used across the board to help us with these complexities that now we're facing in the workforce.
All I can say, Mitra, after all that is wow. When I think about the data and the technology you just mentioned and how the technology is there to really mine the data to make better decisions around these topics, I'm very encouraged. So speaking of data, I want to go into the topic that we often discuss with directors, and that is data privacy and security. So when you think about that, data privacy and security, what comes to mind in this area?
It's interesting. More and more companies are using privacy disclosures in their ESG reports. So we can see that there's definitely a trend. But if you look across the ESG spectrum, we see around from an E or environmental perspective, there's increased pressure on companies to use energy saving methods when they're operating their data centers and their server farms. From an S perspective, social perspective, there's heightened awareness around a company's obligation to secure personal data from their workforce and their customers. But board members should, from a governance perspective, should really focus on a couple different areas where technology is playing a very significant role. Organizational control systems and data management processes. A lot of companies for their organizational control systems are moving to the zero trust model. And don't get fooled by the name. Zero trust is actually a security model where you're not securing the entire network, but you're using identity management controls, strict identity management controls over apps and data. And companies are using, automation tools to automate those processes, like, handling data security, consent, and notice. And others are using AI and machine learning to track and monitor, analyze, and even predict cyber threats and breaches. So there's a lot going on there. That's, pretty straightforward. And I think that companies, as they move to the zero trust model, have good blueprints to go by. What's difficult is this new world of data management post-cookie. So as you know, more and more regulatory restrictions like GDPR and CCPA are placed on organizations to restrict their access to tracking user data. And consumers are now very skittish about sharing their personal information. So the question becomes, how can organizations maximize the value of the data that they are permitted to have in the most responsible way? And because we're in this evolving regulatory space and it's shifting so rapidly, technology solutions in this space are, I think, at best sort of stopgap solutions. For example, we're seeing companies move away from data management platforms, the traditional data management platforms where they have the third-party user data, which, some of it was acquired, without permission of the users. They're moving away from that, and they're moving towards the customer data platforms. Customer data platforms enable us to integrate and consolidate data from a variety of sources, offline and online, websites, email platforms, social media, mobile apps, and consolidate that into a single database, inferring a 360 view of a customer using permissible data. Now, again, as I said, this is an evolving space, so I don't know how long this solution can survive, but I do predict that in the very near future, we will find ourselves in a position where organizations will have to pay consumers for their personal data.
So, very informative and all great questions that the directors can start to think about and ask management. So, Mitra, just in closing, any advice to our board of directors after reflecting, put yourself in their shoes, on everything that we just talked about ESG, the role of technology, and the types of questions they could be asking here?
I think it's really important that organizations are digitized. Otherwise, they absolutely cannot take advantage of all the technologies we discussed here or all that's forthcoming. And it's important for boards to recognize that digital transformation is a journey, particularly around ESG, where the regulatory environment is so evolving. Technology solutions may be only a short-term solution and not a long-term plan. So it's important in oversight and governance for board members to recognize what technologies are available, what's emerging, and truly understand the use case so that they can understand the relevance and be able to ask their management teams the questions to pressure test those proposals. This gives them the advantage to be able to prioritize the tech investments based on short, medium, and long-term plans. I think this is really important, and we are going to publish a series of papers that dig deeper into each of these subjects and hopefully give our board members more information to be able to have fruitful discussions and good questions to ask both immediately and in an ongoing basis.
So, Mitra, I can't thank you enough for agreeing to collaborate with me as we provide our directors the tools that they need to ask the right questions when you think about all of these topics. So, thank you again.